Welcome to the Shapes video series highlighting the authors of a newly published book titled The Shapes of Epidemics and Global Disease. My name is Leslie Villagrana, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ian Reid, Associate Professor of Latin American Studies at Soka University of America. Professor Reid co-authored the introduction and authored the essay titled The Tragedy of the Tropic of Capricorn, 19th Century Globalization and Epidemiological Change on Two Sides of South America. Thank you for taking part, Professor Reid. Can you first begin with your chapter's research question?
The chapter comes from research that I've been doing, in which I looked at history of health and disease and slavery and racism in Brazil. I've developed several research questions, such as what is the history of disease in Brazil, the history of epidemics, or race relations in Brazil. This project arose out of those questions. What this chapter does is really expands beyond Brazil. So for Brazil, I found that in the middle of the 19th century, there was a series of awful and unfamiliar epidemic diseases that struck. It began with yellow fever in late 1849 and 1850, and then cholera, which took more lives, especially among slaves and people of color and poor people. Throughout this period too, after 1850 to about 1900, smallpox worsened, and there was also the arrival of bubonic plague. Yellow fever, cholera, and plague were all seen as new to the country and unfamiliar, but also really shaped perceptions of the nation and the people of this nation, which had always seen itself from the colonial period into the national period as a mixed race society, as a society that depended on enslaved peoples, but also was a mixture of indigenous African and European peoples. In this chapter, I looked more broadly at the region, and I asked, was this unusual series of epidemic diseases just confined to Brazil, or did it occur in other parts of South America? If these epidemics occurred, what were the consequences of that? As I began to look into archives and historical sources from Argentina and from Chile, is that a very similar process occurred in these three countries. And that is, the second half of the 19th century experienced these unusual and unfamiliar epidemic diseases. This shook the national confidence of these young countries, planting the seeds of doubt that these nations were capable of kind of fostering a strong, healthy population. But in each of these places, these doubts took very different forms and were either stronger or weaker. So in Brazil, it was the most consequential, right? Brazil really suffered from this loss of confidence because it was accompanied by scientific racism. So it was much easier for Brazil to be fit into the old stereotype of a diseased tropical country with the arrival of these epidemics. But with that stereotype came these very pernicious racist ideas. It was profoundly influential and destructive in Brazil. Chile and Argentina, which had lower populations and abolished slavery earlier and had lower populations of African descent, experienced these epidemics differently. So basically my question was, what were the consequences of changing epidemiological environments on perceptions of nationality in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile?
Can you also explain why your question is so relevant?
The countries that emerged in the 20th century, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, took a distinctive form with a kind of collective self-perception. Especially for Brazil, the consequences were very serious because really over a 400-year period, the elite, the colonizers, the wealthy, the powerful, mostly of European ancestry and who considered themselves to be white, actually took pride in the country's health and mixed race background. Even though I have to say it was racist pride because it still supported ideas of white supremacy, but that the mixed race background in Brazil, its laborers, its workforce, who were of mixed race, were seen as maybe not equal, but dependable. So this period in the second half of the 19th century was very exceptional. I would argue in part because of the impact of epidemic diseases. The greater relevance to this is really the relationship between environment and ideology. Disease occurs with a physical change in the relationship between microbes and humans, at least infectious diseases. And when that relationship changes rapidly across community and with a lot of pain, the event is usually called an epidemic, as we know now, suffering in the COVID-19 pandemic. These periods of fear and grief are always understood using pre-existing categories and norms and culture, and stereotypes matter. especially for colonized peoples. So Europeans and their colonial offshoots had a lot of time to equate the tropics with ill health. And when Brazil's disease environment changed for the worse, it was much easier to place the entire country into pre-existing categories, which is, I think, very relevant. What I'm really trying to get at is the interaction between environment and ideology, between the physical, material world and the cultural and ideological world. As we begin to make sense, for example, COVID-19, which is clearly has a physical, material basis, right? It's the virus. Yet we see such extreme and violent health disparities. Communities of color affected, much worse than others. And we also see a very polarized, politicized world with this current pandemic. Both the physical world matters. Without the virus, we wouldn't have the disease. But the ways that we understand it, the ways that we treat it, and ultimately the ways that we will survive depends on the categories that we use to understand it. I think that this history not only gives us a great deal of knowledge about what Brazil and Argentina and Chile became and where they came from, but also how we can understand epidemics, both from their physical and ideological components, which are always entangled.
Thank you so much for your time and the insightful response. And congratulations on your new publication of The Shapes of Epidemics and Global Disease.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.